Well, today we're digging into the concept of ontological security. Now, this is the fundamental, quite deep-seated psychological need we all have for a continuous and stable sense of who we are, our self-identity. It's an idea that, well, it started in psychiatry with figures like R.D. Laing, and then Anthony Giddens brought it into social theory, and it's been applied pretty powerfully to understand how states behave in international relations.
Right. The state as an actor with similar or at least analogous needs.
Exactly. And that brings us to our central question today, which is really critical. When this sense of security, this ontological security, is severely threatened by some major disruption, how does the actor, whether it's a state or even an individual, respond? Do they primarily seek stability by rigidly sticking to the routines they already know, or do they go for reflexive change, diverging from the status quo? So I'll be arguing that this essential need for confidence, for predictability, it inherently pushes actors towards becoming attached to their established, routinized practices, even, and this is key, even when those practices might seem dysfunctional or even dangerous from another perspective.
And, well, I'm going to argue that focusing only on that rigidity really misses the mark. I think reflexivity, the capacity for conscious reflection and adjustment, is actually a crucial part of seeking ontological security. It allows and sometimes even necessitates fundamental change when the old routines just aren't working anymore, when they become untenable.
Okay, well, I see why you might think that, but let me try and give you a slightly different perspective on this. My position really starts from the idea that ontological security, that confidence we have in who we are and the sort of constancy of our social world, it's achieved mainly through creating predictable routines. This understanding suggests that the need for ontological security, or OS as it's sometimes called, is a constant driver, a motive for both individuals and states. And the crucial implication here is this role of emotional attachment. Actors, like states, they get attached to these routines. Think of a long-standing rivalry maybe, or a particular trade relationship, because these routines stabilize their identity. They provide confident expectations about how the world works and how others will act. And this attachment, well, it helps explain behaviors that might look irrational if you're only thinking about physical security. States might become, sort of attached to conflict, as Jennifer Mitzen argues, because that established competitive routine provides a recognized collective identity. So when a trauma happens, like, say, the 9/11 attacks in the U.S., the immediate response is often this psychological retreat, activating familiar narratives, maybe conservative, militaristic ones, that reinforce the established sense of self, even if maybe the new threat doesn't perfectly fit that old Cold War mold. Stability, continuity, that gets prioritized over perhaps more efficient adaptation.
Okay. I come on it from, a different way. I'm sorry, but I just don't entirely buy that the outcome is limited purely to rigid attachment. I mean, sure, attachment is powerful. I grant you that. But focusing solely on rigidity ignores the critical role of reflexivity, which was inherent in the theory right from Giddens' original work. He was actually quite careful to argue that routines aren't just mindless habit. They require constant vigilance and creativity to manage the inevitable disruptions of social life. That is reflexivity in action. We're constantly monitoring and adjusting our behavior in relation to our goals and our environment.
But is that adjustment always fundamental change?
What Giddens actually noted that a blind, sort of dogged commitment to established routines, especially when there's mounting evidence they're failing, that actually borders on neurotic compulsion. So a robust understanding, a comprehensive conceptualization of ontological security has to account for change. When severe disruptions cause this chronic cognitive dissonance, when a state's established actions just don't align anymore with its core sense of self, conscious reflection is really the only path forward. And this reflexive realization, it forces fundamental divergence. It forces change in practices and norms to restore that confidence, rather than just desperately clinging to the old, perhaps painful way of doing things.
But the mechanism of emotional attachment, it implies that the security itself is derived from the certainty, from the predictability. That makes continuity the prioritized goal. The real crisis, the thing that generates deep insecurity, is when our basic trust in the world, in the predictability of others and ourselves is compromised. When that trust disappears, the actor naturally, almost instinctively, rigidly clings to the known patterns. I mean, think about this security dilemma in international relations. States often fall into these competitive routines, right? And Mitson's work suggests that while this is dangerous physically, the resulting interaction is predictable. The role identities, the rival, the enemy, the protector, they're sustained by this mutual recognition. So continuing the competition, even if it's dysfunctional, is often the immediate, rational choice from an ontological security perspective, because it offers expectations about the social world that prevent a kind of existential paralysis.
That's a compelling argument. I see the logic there, but if certainty is the absolute key, have you considered that continued adherence to failing established practices could actually increase ontological anxiety? Think about it. When a routine becomes forced, when it feels contrived, the actor has to spend excessive energy performing a role that feels increasingly disconnected from reality, from their sense of self. So, if established practices, let's say maintaining open borders or certain international trade policies, are directly fueling internal political upheaval and deep anxieties about economic stability or national identity back home, then rigidly sticking to those practices becomes counterproductive. It actually makes the actor feel less secure, not more. We might be seeing, preliminary evidence of this in the West's recent divergence from some established international norms around trade or migration. That inward turn, arguably, occurred because maintaining the status quo felt unfeasible and was exacerbating the internal anxieties threatening the state's sense of self. Change became the path to reducing that dissonance. And, reflexivity is characteristic of all human action. Giddens was clear on that. It's how we navigate the world. Ignoring it means the theory, it fails to account for profound changes we see in world politics. When a powerful state chooses to diverge from long-established international practices, maybe by ramping up protectionism or pulling out of international agreements, that choice dramatically alters the expectations and the webs of understanding, as some put it, for all the other actors in the system. If this kind of divergence becomes widespread, it can induce a system-wide shift away from the established status quo. So ontological security seeking, when driven by this necessary, reflective choice to change, can actually become a powerful engine for creating new norms and transforming the system.
Okay, I see why you'd highlight the macro scale, the potential for systemic change. But I think reflexivity alone doesn't guarantee breaking free from negative dynamics. You need something else. Healthy ontological security, a foundation of it, actually conditions the ability to tolerate change. Without that prerequisite, that sort of healthy, basic trust in oneself and the environment, actors lack the capacity, the psychological space to learn their way out of conflict or dysfunction. We have to anchor this discussion in the preconditions for change. The state's choice of action, ultimately, is based on what provides stability to its identity. If the competitive routine is the stable identity, then continuing it, regardless of the material cost, is the rational choice for that ontologically insecure actor seeking stability above all else. I mean, look at the failure of something like the Oslo peace process. That entire process was explicitly based on incremental learning, on reflexive adjustment, right? Yet, arguably, it failed because it didn't sufficiently address the fundamental lack of basic trust and mutual recognition needed to nurture a new, shared, mutually secure identity. Without that underlying trust, the actors defaulted back to the known, rigid identities of adversaries.
That brings us right back to the micro level, doesn't it? Where this theory started with Laing's work on the deeply insecure individual. Laing observed that the ontologically insecure person isn't primarily concerned with, say, self-gratification. They're preoccupied with simply preserving their existence, their sense of being real. And to manage that intense anxiety, the fear of collapsing, of imploding, of losing themselves, they often employ psychological defenses. One he famously described was the false self system. It's like building this emotional armor, pretending to be something they're not to face the world. But the tragic irony is that while this defense is meant to mitigate anxiety, it often ends up aggravating the underlying conditions. The rigid attachment to this empty routine, this false self, it ultimately leads to feelings of futility, emptiness, and can even push towards deeper psychological fragmentation, even psychotic developments in extreme cases. The rigid defense, ironically, becomes a profound risk to one's very being.
I'm still not fully convinced by drawing that direct parallel because the application to the state level seems to suggest a crucial functional difference. Even if the routine the state is attached to is dysfunctional, like Mitt's insecurity dilemma example, the attachment itself provides security. Security against the absolute, paralyzing, incapacitating uncertainty of not knowing who you are or what the world means. The alternative to the entrenched routine isn't necessarily a better routine. It's often perceived as deep, paralyzing uncertainty, the state of not knowing who one is, or which dangers one should even confront. That is the true identity threat that prevents agency, prevents confident action. So, for a state facing acute anxiety, the immediate motivation, the most pressing need, is often just to repeat the known routine, however costly it might seem externally, because that repetition provides some expectations and safeguards their capacity to act confidently in the world, to be an actor. So ultimately, I think the concept of ontological security really illuminates this deep, almost primal psychological attachment actors have to their established narratives, their established routines, simply because certainty is so vital for agency, for being able to act at all. And this attachment mechanism, it helps explain why seemingly irrational conflicts persist and why the initial response to trauma or severe disruption often involves a rigidifying of behavior. It's an attempt to restore a confident sense of self, even if the result might compromise physical safety or other goals.
That's an interesting way to frame it, though. I would perhaps frame it slightly differently. While I agree the attachment to routines is powerful, and maybe it's the initial default response, I still maintain that ontological security theory is robust enough to account for fundamental change, precisely because Gittins insisted on reflexivity as inherent to agency. The empirical evidence we're seeing, perhaps, of major states diverging from established international practices when facing chronic internal dissonance, it demonstrates that OS seeking isn't limited to just continuity. It can be a powerful engine for systemic transformation when the status quo becomes fundamentally threatening and simple adherence is just, well, impossible or too psychologically costly.
So it seems both adherence to routines and divergence from them have the potential to either stabilize or destabilize that core sense of self, depending on the context.
Exactly. Which highlights just how vital reflexivity is in determining the state's response. It's this complex interplay, isn't it, between the universal need for certainty and the sometimes absolutely necessary reflective act of fundamental change in identity. It certainly warrants continued, detailed examination within the source material and beyond.